For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them. He hath delivered them to the slaughter. Continuing with the 34th chapter of Isaiah, we come upon the prophecy, for the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations. The Hebrew word ki is a conjunction, typically translated because or for. And the reason is about to be given for this tremendous urgency that it was expressed in verse 1, that the Lord's witness be heard, that it be heard by successive generations of mankind. And this urgency has to do with a thing called wrath. And the Hebrew word translated indignation is usually translated wrath in the King James. And this is the word used for the wrath that David pled never to receive when he prophesies, O Lord, rebuke me not in thy wrath, neither chasten me in thy hot displeasure. And it is the same word used in Jeremiah's prophecies in respect to the wrath that is to be poured upon Babylon. And this next phrase of this prophecy constitutes the most controversial aspect of the gospel. And it makes the gospel a thing of reproach in the mind of the world. Isaiah's prophecy states that the Lord's indignation, his wrath, is upon all nations. And again, as explained in verse 1, the Hebrew word translated nations is the primary word for both Gentiles and nations in the King James. And while in English we do distinguish between nations and Gentiles, well, the Hebrew does not, and prophecy does not. Gentile has a prophetic meaning, as does the word Jew. It now bears merit in making this point clear through Paul's teaching. Paul writes, For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, neither is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. So clearly then, the prophetic Gentile is an allusion to the spiritually unconverted and unregenerate, upon whom the wrath of God does rest. And when we read, For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, as a prophetic allusion for unregenerate humanity. And therefore this once obscure prophecy is no longer obscure, as those who have accepted the gospel, well, we know what this means. It means something the world will not accept. And this is the foundational premise of the Christian faith that is clearly being expressed here, and which causes the gospel to be a reproach in the eyes of the world. The prophecy declares, as explanation for its urgent call to hear what God is testifying to, that God's wrath is upon the entirety of humanity. As this is the underlying premise of the gospel, what bears our review and our reasserting, lest we drift into like-mindedness with the world. Paul states that we all occupy the same condition before God. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. And this is because we all descend from the same fallen progenitor. Whereof, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. And so we have a spiritual principle with spiritual consequences, even a universal spiritual condition shared by all mankind by virtue of the mystical Adam. In fact, Paul states directly that Adam was a symbol of something. He writes, Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. Man's natural existence, that of the earthly man, Adam, has been infected by sin, rendering all the earth's offspring, see verse 1, disaffected from the true life and substance of God that is spiritual. And therefore even the sanctified apostle must lament with us, For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. Being infected by sin is not a mere static condition, as if to say one's eyes are blue. No, it is an active principle that factors into every action, every word, all thought, what we emote. And so Paul continues, "For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. For the good that I would do, I do not. But the evil which I would not, that I do." And therefore, yes, sin is a universal concept, and therefore the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations. We're all familiar with the common objection to this from unbelievers, as well as some believers, is that a righteous God would not condemn those who never heard the gospel. But that is another issue that goes beyond this prophecy. Paul does tell us that sin is not imputed where there is no law. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. And Paul speaks of the law in the sense of the moral conscience. As remember, he writes elsewhere, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, and their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them." And this is why the law is a universal principle, because it is the governor of that universal principle we call free moral conscience. To the extent we have the latter, we come under the rod of the former. And the law is a spiritual principle capable of coming down upon us with painful, agonizing, and even disastrous personal and spiritual consequences. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. And when the law is revealed from heaven, it strikes the human conscience. And many religious revivals, particularly those occurring in the 18th and 19th centuries, were characterized by God's revelation of the law, striking men with anxiety, panic, and sometimes prolonged agony, until a divine peace was granted through holding fast to a profession of Jesus Christ. Jonathan Edwards tells various accounts of this widespread phenomenon in his day, and he even formulated doctrine on the subject. A link to more on this is provided below. Those early decades in America and Europe were called the Great Awakening, and according to those who ministered then, those revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries were especially characterized by an awakening of conscience to the condemnation of the law. And the Welsh revival of 1904 carried similar manifestations. But we know that ultimately there will be a universal revelation of this prophetic truth, that the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations.